It's great to be together. And what a exciting time for folks who have been working so hard for years to change the way Vermonters and Americans grow food and feed themselves. Things have never looked better. Markets for local, organic, pasture food are the fastest growing segment of the market. Farmers markets are popping up like mushrooms on a spring morning. For the first time in more than a century, the number of farmers counted by the Department of Ag has actually gone up, not down. Michael Pollan's 3 books on food have been on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 200 consecutive weeks. Americans, bless his heart, Americans everywhere are having a conversation now about food. Before getting elected, this man actually said these words, and I'm quoting, "Our entire agricultural system is built on cheap oil," end quote. So we've all heard about the White House having a garden. Did you know that they actually have a beehive, a presidential beehive? It's right there in the middle there. I actually saw it. I'm interested in their Secret Service detail. But this is it. So what's happening with organic agriculture right now all across the country got its start in many ways right here in Vermont in the 1970s, when there were only a few scattered, isolated farmers trying to farm and trying to live their lives a different sort of way. Maybe it got its start even before then. Maybe back in 1952, around this stone wall garden at the homestead of Helen and Scott Nearing. What an amazing journey it's been from those beginnings to this week when Wes Jackson was here in Burlington on Monday and Secretary Vilsack will be here in a few hours. What an exciting time to be part of NOFA. And you have every right to celebrate the journey and be grateful that your hard work is really paying off and that others are listening. It is in these moments of strength and success, I believe, that it's also really important to pause and see where the journey is going to take us next. You know, we're farmers. We don't believe in gloating, and we know very well that the weather's going to change. Many of you are in the fields every day, a fact alone that makes you privileged and I think burdened with some responsibilities. I've always believed that you make a living by what you earn, but you make a life by what you give away. And your livelihood comes from the fields and the forests, absolutely, but your purpose and your meaning is in translating that land for the rest of us. It's your gift to every Vermonter. You speak a language of the land, you read rows of crops the way others read books, and you know soils the way business people know venture capital. Yours is such a rare and important knowledge in this modern world we're in. You help us to know and care for one another. And you do that through food. The way we grow food in Vermont and all across this country absolutely can nurture a culture of care and attention, a culture of belonging, if you will. When it's healthy for all of those involved and when it builds connections and relationships, that possibility is right there in the story of food. What's in it, who grew it, where it comes from, and most importantly, I think, who gets it. When that process is both healthy and fair, food knits us all together. And folks don't need to be nutritionalists or sociologists or food security advocates to know this. They know it in their heart. It's a story that sticks. Food is relationship, and land is relationship too. And if you believe this is true, and I've staked my life on it, then we all must live with the awareness that in Vermont today, some have this relationship and some don't. And as much as I believe that land and food are about relationship, I also strongly believe that we can never stop caring, either out of ignorance or just plain tiredness, about those who don't have this relationship. This is the exact moment to look up and see who's alongside us today and who is not, and to ask ourselves why. Who is not here today? Who could not afford to be here? Who works the land but could not understand what I'm saying because they may not speak my language? It is in our moment of success that we owe it to the dream to pose these questions. We will grow within the answers. Every one of us in this room is up to that challenge. There is something that we have not yet said aloud. Born in New England and the Pacific Northwest, our sustainable agriculture movement is hardworking, it's dedicated, well-intentioned, and it's overwhelmingly white and middle class. Will this food movement that we have nurtured succeed if it's accessible only to folks like most of us here today? NOFA, Feed, Two Rivers, Salvation Farms, others represented right here in this room are working hard, really hard, to improve food access for low-income Vermonters. 29% of Vermont kids in public schools rely on free breakfast and lunch program. They are also the face of this movement. How do we see and honor and learn from all of these stories of the food movement? And what is the danger today of just a single story? And for that, I want to introduce you to the Nigerian novelist, winner of the MacArthur Award, Chimamanda Adichie.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamaralaye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise.
Do we risk having a single story about sustainable farming or about family farms in Vermont? What is the face of that story? Is it a man or a woman or a young child? Is she white or is she a person of color? What language do they speak? Does he wear a crisp white shirt and tie or a sweat-stained t-shirt? Or is it all of those? This moment of success asks something entirely different of every one of us in this room. This call is not to do more or to get bigger, but instead to pause long enough to consider who is alongside us and what each of us can do to be good allies. How do we grow our movement so it's deeply connected to this man, Brahma Mahdi of Oakland, who founded People's Grocery to bring healthy food to urban neighborhoods where liquor stores stood in place of grocery stores, or this woman, Paula Garcia of New Mexico, who's conserving culture through the conservation of traditional waterways, or Andrea Hanks of Minnesota, who works with her people to protect their sovereign rights to grow and harvest their own food without fear of being persecuted, prosecuted by corporations, or Nelson Carrasquillo, who organizes farm workers in New Jersey to get them fair wages, less exposure to pesticides, and a relationship to the land that is more than labor. They care deeply about soil, about healthy food, about biodiversity too. But to be honest, they don't always see themselves in our story. It is through food justice that we have the great opportunity to connect into one movement, those of us who care about protecting marginalized people and those who care about protecting the land. Our speaker this morning, LaDonna Redmond, will challenge our single story of what a farmer does, what a farmer looks like, and she'll challenge the idea that urban people need to rely on rural food producers. Born on the south side of Chicago, LaDonna has always had a calling and a big heart and the strength to follow that heart. She was first called to work for women who were recovering from substance abuse, and then she worked with one of the first community organizations and U.S. Department of Justice's Weed and Seed program to plant seeds of rehabilitation. LaDonna helped start Safe Haven, an afternoon school program serving hundreds of kids every day. And her energy, her life energy, became focused on food justice 10 years ago when her firstborn, Wade, was diagnosed with asthma induced by food allergies. When trying to create healthy meals that were free of pesticides for her son, she discovered that the only way to do that was to purchase organic food. But the kind of stores that sold organic food were far away and upscale. The closest stores to LaDonna's family sold liquor and chips. So LaDonna had the resources to travel any distance she needed for food, but she was concerned about mothers that didn't have a car, didn't have internet or the money or the college education to be able to make other decisions. And when trying to help Wade, LaDonna began to research food production and what she learned about genetically modified food, about the heavy use of pesticides, about food irradiation. It set her on fire. Why hadn't she heard about any of this before? Why were all the materials aimed at white and middle-class audiences? LaDonna developed a farmer's market, then food co-ops, then food clubs, which all led to the creation of the Institute for Community Resource Development to bring locally grown food into her part of Chicago. In 2009, LaDonna and her business partner, Will Seeger, opened Graffiti and Grub, a for-profit market staffed by inner-city kids. Graffiti and Grub isn't just about getting rid of the food desert in Chicago. It's about transforming healthy living into an integral part of an urban minority culture. LaDonna is proving that there's no reason for healthy, locally grown food to be limited to the well-off, the rich, or that it can't be grown in a city. LaDonna knows that food is cheaper and healthier when it's grown locally, and she's hoping to catch a whole generation before they have ingested the notion that health and relationship to the land is only for the affluent.
A woman on Chicago's South Side is working to bring organic produce into an area that many call a kind of food desert. She's doing it with hard work and a lot of hope. Jose Sanders has more in today's Live Green with ABC7 report.
In some neighborhoods, access to fresh food is hard to come by. There are literally no grocery stores. Well, now, one woman is trying to change that with help from the youth in her community. The bright colors of fresh produce are a rare sight in this neighborhood. It's no wonder they're compelling drivers who exit the Dan Ryan Expressway near 59th Street to stop and shop.
The space happens to be between what is called food deserts, two so-called food deserts, Inglewood and Washington Park. So actually we're in an ideal location to really deliver our message of healthy food and particularly increasing the consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables.
A dearth of grocery stores in the area helped motivate LaDonna Redmond to create an outlet to distribute organic produce. She calls her small store Graffiti and Grub. She and her business partner are training and motivating young adults to lead the effort in their community.
What I tell the young men particularly is that it's my job to make sure that they feel the connection with getting out there and begin to create opportunities for themselves.
Young people sell the produce. They also help turn a nearby vacant lot into a garden with the Washington Park Homeowners Association.
This was our attempt to kind of empower ourselves by growing vegetables and fruits ourselves.
The goal is for the garden to supply food for sale at the store, while the youth learn the business from farm to fork. They say the experience is also influencing their personal habits.
It was a great experience because I learned a lot about planning and watching my calories because I was eating a lot of unhealthy foods.
When I've been introduced to how eating healthy is not only good for you, but it's also good fruit. So, I mean, it's just enlightened me a lot.
Environmentalists, organic food, healthy living, those are all concepts that are needed for all Americans, not just those who can afford them or have the education to care. Graffiti and Grub is born of the black urban hip-hop culture. It represents the claims of poor minority culture to what LaDonna calls real wealth, wealth of spirit, of health, not wealth just of the pocketbook. Essence magazine called her among 12 women shaping the world. The Root calls her a green-collar hero. Time magazine called her a freedom fighter and honored her among 25 that are changing the world. All that's really nice. But what's far more important is this, that she's here. And that she's here because she cares about what you do. We're all people of one blood. We are all people working within one giant movement to feed the people and to restore a life of meaning. 800 Vermonters, please give LaDonna welcome.